This is your home for St. Cloud State hockey, keeping you up to date on the NCHC.
One-timer coming, they score! Ripped in! A bomb from Pervix!
Women's WCHA.
So Dana Rasmussen fires and she scores! Dana Rasmussen for the Huskies alongside
The National Hockey League.
Dwayne Kaprizov in for a chance to win it! He scores! Kirill, the thrill is for real! Welcome to the NHL, a game winner!
And everything from the state of hockey.
St. Cloud Cathedral is now 42.6 seconds away from wrapping up the school's first ever title.
Welcome to the Huskies Warming House Podcast Den. The Huskies Warming House podcast is also brought to you by the Soda Pod, home of NCAA college hockey news and more. Stay wild and up to date with new episodes throughout every week. Find them on Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and other podcast platforms. And welcome into the Huskies Warming House podcast, episode 178 here in the den. Nick Max and Noah Grant here for another installment of Huskies Hockey. And Nick, we are getting to about that time. We are about 2 weeks away from St. Cloud hockey getting back in action. And fittingly enough, the women's hockey team for the team in the Granite City is announcing some new news, and hockey is essentially ramping up around the city for some collegiate action. So we're going to talk a lot about that to start the show. And then we're also, why not? We're going to continue on the NCHC train here. Only two more non-St. Cloud teams to go. This one coming in at number 3 on our list. And a team that, again, like the previous group in Western Michigan, continues to kind of go under the radar a little bit in the NCHC. And they quietly slotted into a home spot somewhat comfortably. But an interesting finish to their season and left a lot to be desired, I think, is probably the easiest way to put that. So, Nick, leaves are changing here, by the way. How are things going post Minnesota State Fair? We talked about that last week. Has the depression fully set in? How are we doing?
Yeah, actually it has. So the State Fair in Labor Day was one of the hottest that I've remembered. I mean, it was over 100 degrees, and that's not something you expect, especially around Minnesota. But in true Minnesota fashion, if you don't like the weather, wait 5 minutes. And no question, literally on Wednesday, we went from about 95 degrees and damn near 100 degrees again on Monday to a sweltering 67 on Wednesday. So it really changed quite quick. So I think now that, shall we say, those temps are sadly behind us as a double-edged sword, right? The acceptance part of the grieving process has begun here in Minnesota, that summer is officially over, and we're getting ready and prepped for what's ahead, which there's some good and bad news to that, right? No, especially on the weather front side of things, but definitely everybody's in fall mode.
Yeah, 5 stages of grief here going on in the Huskies Warming House podcast. It is true, though. I mean, I walked out of the hospital. I walked into the hospital on Tuesday night because, that's how work works. And it was warm. I mean, it was like, high 80s, low 90s throughout the day. And I came out in the morning and it was freezing. And it was like, well, there goes all that humidity and whatever was going on. I mean, we're definitely into that moment. By the way, before we get started, in case you haven't noticed, I'm sure people have picked up on this by now. Maybe you haven't. Maybe we're revealing our secrets here. If you haven't noticed, we do have some different attire on at times here for the Huskies Warming House podcast, and we've had different looks throughout the weeks. Yes, some of our segments recently have been pre-recorded because I have been jam-packed and extremely busy at the hospital, so something to just kind of keep an eye on. Yes, it is true, we do have some pre-recorded stuff, but some really great content to talk to, and we can't wait to do it here on the Huskies Warming House podcast. So without further ado, we start with Center Ice View News and Notes presented by HuskiesIllustrated.com and the Soda Pod. Center Ice View News and Notes. Center Ice View provides you with the best coverage of St. Cloud State Huskies hockey, from game notes, recaps, photos, and more. Go to centericeview.com. Huskies Warming House podcast, episode 178, main portion of the show. Nick Max and Noah Grant. And Nick, it's been a week for women's hockey here. Again, like I said, we are getting ramped up. St. Cloud State hockey in full swing here, just a couple of weeks away. Nick, we just kind of broke the fourth wall and talked about the fact that some people have probably noticed already, which is, some of our stuff is pre-recorded. But what we can tell you, speaking of looking ahead, by the way, and schedules and other things here, is that in a couple weeks, actually the next time that we release a show on the men's side of things, we're going to actually have the show release moved to Tuesdays. We'll mention that coming up as well, too, so people know that. But on the 26th of this month of September, when we do the next men's show, which is Denver, regardless, the question is, do we have them at number 2 or do we have them at number 1? We will actually have our show moved to Tuesdays. The reason being is that is the first week that Huskies hockey is back. So it gives us an extra day to kind of work with as far as getting recaps done each week and kind of get ready for the season. So just pay attention to that as we move into late September and October. Women's hockey playing the weekend of the 23rd through the 25th, 2 weeks from today, almost, I guess I should say, a little bit less than that. So without further ado, St. Cloud State women's hockey, we will touch on this more when we do their preview, but some notable enough news to talk about here. They have released their captains, the women's team have, for this upcoming season, and there's a lot, let's just put it that way. And I think that kind of gives you an idea of the leadership core that they have. Taylor Lynn, her second season wearing the captains. Clara Himlarova, Emma Gentry, Dale Ross, Addie Scribner, and Grace Wolf. Yes, try saying that 10 times fast. So there you go. You've got 5 people that are wearing the assistant captainship there. It kind of gives you an idea of where we're at here. Taylor Lynn, the fourth 2-year captain in program history. Kenzie Wiley was the last, by the way. So, I mean, I don't mind this leadership group. Clara Himlarova, obviously, no surprise for her 5th season as a Husky. Emma Gentry getting ready for her next upperclassman campaign. Addie Scribner as well. And then Grace Wolf and Dale Ross, the youngest of this group, both in year number 3 for them, respectively. So, Nick, Brian Idolski, not afraid to lead with intention, but diversify by committee, if that makes sense, when he's deferring to the players here. Anything you make of this move, or are you just ready for some women's hockey again?
Well, let's start backwards, right? Yes, I'm ready for some women's hockey, especially with this club. I think there's a lot of growth still yet to see. And I think with some of the changes that we have seen in the roster, I think that this team is primed to make a pretty nice, sizable jump in the win-loss column, and more so on the offensive side of the puck. But more on that later, right? 6 captains, right? It's the most that they've ever carried in program history, surpassing 4 that actually did the last couple of seasons. And we talked about this throughout the year last year, and that was really when Idolski came in. He essentially held up a mirror and said, hey, the reason why we're here is, well, the locker room, right?
Right.
If we're going to, become a competitive program, there's changes that we're going to make as a coaching staff, but we also expect changes out of the players, right? And I think having 6 captains, right, you really are handing some of the keys over to the players, right? You're saying, okay, you guys know what I expect when you're, with this program. And now it's really time to take charge and make this your own, right? I'm more of a guide. I'm more of a, I can give you the tools to be successful. But the reality is this is your team. And the voice is just much more powerful, right, Noah, when it's coming from a teammate, right? It's not that you don't respect your coaches, what they have to offer and say, but it just hits differently when it's coming from your teammates, your captains. You really want the team to do it. I mean, we talk about this with Brett Larson on the men's side all the time, right? In key games, we talk about that game against Colorado College again a couple of years ago, up in the COVID year, right? He said there really wasn't much I had to say when they went down 1-0 to the Tigers, because really the players took charge of it. They kept each other calm. They knew what had to be done. that's what Adolski's really sending a message here, is that it's now time for the girls to take over this team and to lead from within, and more of Adolski to take more of a backseat approach. So that's what I gather from it. I'm curious to your thoughts on this and if you see it the same way I do.
Yeah, certainly would agree. I think that it kind of goes, it's almost like when you go to the mentality of you don't have to wear a letter to have a voice in this locker room. And Brian Idolski said, well, we'll just give you all a letter.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, that's just kind of what it comes down to, is trusting that leadership group. And I think that it also cements, moving forward here, Clara Himlarova, maybe Emma Gentry, depending on if she decides to maybe turn pro after this season, whatever it is, it gives you kind of an idea of the leadership group that's going to be ready going forward, a group that can be relied upon going forward. So I think it's really exciting here. Speaking of Brian Idolski, by the way, and Brett Larson for that matter, actually 3 new coaches, by the way, all things considered, across the St. Cloud teams, one of them essentially double dipping, one on the women's side, one on the men's side here. So maybe just a brief touch here. We're not going to give too much away just because of the fact that we will touch on these again during our previews for each teams. But on the women's side, earlier last month, I should say, Billy Hengen was named as the assistant coach for the women's hockey team. Really kind of made his name at Gentry Academy in recent years in terms of his ability to kind of, development process, getting players ready for the next level here. 4-year playing career for him. Craig Dahl and Bob Motzko were the head coaches on the men's side here, so definitely knows the game at the collegiate level. So excited for him to come in on the women's side. On the men's side, I still love this one every time because Clark Custer has now been officially promoted to an assistant coach here for St. Cloud State. This was announced just recently as well. I still love the fact that we anticipated that he would be a potential entry for his initial role as video coordinator and director of operations last season. And we were like on that. I don't know. It's one of my favorite picks that we've done on the show. So he's going to be a full-time assistant coach for this group, meaning there is a void at that previous position, director of operations and video coordinator. And it's Lenny Hoffman that has been announced, by the way. He will oversee this operation for both squads here, both men's and women's here. So 14 seasons across the game of hockey at the collegiate and junior level, past 3 years with Alaska Fairbanks as an assistant. So I guess if you're going to bring in Carl Falk, you might as well just, snag a coach as well to it and bring him into the mix. So I tell you what, Alaska Fairbanks, you kind of hurt for them a little bit, I feel like, as a program, but it also kind of shows their success they had last season. A lot of big name players and coaches from that program last season that have went to even bigger names across the country here. And I think that speaks volumes about the success that the Nanooks had last season. But this one we can expand just slightly on here. Lenny Hoffman, what an interesting and unique challenge for him to be able to do this across, both hockey teams. I think, Nick, you and I can attest very well with working in junior hockey, having full-time jobs and covering both St. Cloud State men's and women's. He might have his work cut out for him, but we'll have to see how he manages that.
Yeah, first of all, to do it for one team is a lot of work, right? Then to double dip for 2. But you kind of wonder too, because, Idolski and Larson, again, have a history playing on the same team. Again, was it the Madison Monsters back in the old pro days there?
All I know is Brett still had hair. So
right. Hairlines were different, but hockey line's the same. But, you kind of also wonder, too, that creates maybe a linkage a bit where, you're going to have maybe some ideas go back and forth between both coaches, right? But for this new guy specifically, Lenny Hoffman, that's a lot. That's a lot of film. And granted, I kind of wonder how, they're going to split time, right? Because it's not like, if they're both on the road, he can be they're one or the other, right? So
yeah, the travel, that's exactly it. I think it's one thing if they play in the same building or they play in the same general region, but I think with travel and even just the double headers, I mean, you and I have worked plenty of those double headers, and it's by Friday you're excited for hockey, and by Sunday you're like, don't even show me a hockey rink. I mean, that's just kind of
well, because Saturday night, depending on the league that we're in, right? You're on the bus Saturday night all the way through the night, and you can't wait to get home, and you're sleeping at 6:30 in the morning.
Yeah, or depending on the women's schedule, they might still play on Sunday too. So I mean, it might kind of be spread out accordingly. So but I think this is exciting. Obviously all teams getting ready for our last little topic here, the Puck Drop Breakfast. This will be Sunday, September 17th. Actually, this upcoming little bit here. And then, of course, St. Cloud State women's hockey gets ready soon thereafter that week, actually. Brett Larson will be there, Brian Idolski, some student athletes will be there, Robin Wacker, Director of Athletics, Holly Schreiner. And then, of course, hosted like it usually is by some guy, I don't know, some radio guy, Jim Erickson. You heard of him? I don't know.
No, he's all right.
Yeah. Always love catching up with him. Got to last see him actually at the Gophers St. Cloud game in the NCAAs, and it was really fun catching up with him and hearing what he was up to. So, the Puck Jock Breakfast, easy for me to say, was my first foray into St. Cloud hockey way back in the fall of 2019 when everything was a little different in the world. And times are much simpler, I suppose. But Nick, that's kind of like your first official not book end, but book start, so to speak, for the upcoming season for both of these squads. It really is the indicator of, okay, like this is it. We are in full swing. Obviously, the players and coaches have probably been in it for months already, but that's kind of
really nowadays, does it?
Yeah, exactly. But that's kind of the public's first glimpse at, this is the new group. This is the expectation. Here we are. We're ready to rock and roll. Always an exciting event, Nick, I think is probably the easiest way to put that.
Yeah, and it gets a chance for the fan base to, kind of get intimate too with the coaching staff, right, and some of the players, right? I think it's, we talk about, from our chairs, right, when you've worked in the broadcast side of things, or maybe in the, shall we say, the front office side of things, and and maybe we're just immune to it, because we're just so immersed in, that atmosphere. But for the fans and the casual fans, there's, besides going to a game, like when can you really feel like you can interact with, the team directly, right? So I think these little community outreach events, which is really what this is, right? Are just great ways to reconnect with the fan base, to get some excitement going, and kind of get a feel with, what you got coming up, right? And I think the one thing about the Huskies too is, hey, how about this last 10 years? 8 NCAA appearances, 5 straight, which is tied for the longest current active streak in all of Division I college hockey. So, I mean, you talk about a team that, an hour and a half north of Minneapolis that has half, if not even less than half of the resources of some of the other schools that are out there. And they've been on a pretty hell of a run the last, 10 to 15 years.
Yeah.
Under some great leadership with Motzko and again, now Brett Larson. These are great little things to get the fan base involved, to get them excited, and to get them ready for the upcoming season, which, as we will talk about in a week or two here, Noah, plenty of optimism for Huskies fans here coming up.
Yeah, absolutely. And then a program best 18 wins on the women's side under first-year coach Brian Idolski. Curious to see if he has a sophomore slump or continues that success and can be the first to get this program to 20. That would be really exciting.
I think it's possible. I really do.
Oh, yeah.
And I think both you and I are on that same train with Idolski. Again, the defensive structures there. Now, can you add a little bit more offensive punch to the other side on the sheet of ice? So, and I think with at least on paper, they've definitely added some offense to their roster. Now, does it all culminate and produce results? We have yet to see, but there's certainly, you can't fault them for effort, because there definitely is some higher profile players that are being attracted to this program. And Adolski, again, being a big part of that reason. I do think we could easily eclipse that 20 win mark this year in year number 2.
Yeah, and a lot of veteran experience too. And as Oprah Winfrey would say about the captains, you get a letter, you get a letter. With that being said, though, speaking of numbers, coming in at number 3, the same they did last season, 1 point ahead of our St. Cloud State Huskies on the men's side. Our next team coming in at number 3, obviously very successful season for them, all things considered, in the NCHC.
Yeah, it really was. And I think you hit in the open very well. This team, just because they don't have the name power, they don't have, maybe that star power that other teams, even including St. Cloud, right, that can maybe, put them maybe on the national map early on. But, calmly and quietly, this team continues to produce year after year. They continue to get better in all facets of the ice. I think a big reason why we have them where we are is it's not that we'll put it this way. We expect them to get better, but more so we don't expect them to slide.
Exactly where they finished a year ago, the Nebraska-Omaha, the UNO Mavericks. Nick, and this is a program, again, that has earned a reputation for being a blue-collar workhorse type team, a team that I guess I would say is filled with a lot of players that maybe might not be the most high-end players, but a lot of players that are maybe right below that tier that develop into those players as they go through, similar to when we talked about Western Michigan a couple of weeks ago. Nick, what do we have here as you're taking over here for Nebraska-Omaha?
We have a team that, we talk about wild cards, right, Noah? This one is up there again as far as being a wild card. We're going to talk a little bit more in depth about the last season, right? So, Noah, for them last year, 19-15-3 overall. That was good for third in the NCHC for 42 points, specifically 13-9-2 in conference play. They lost to North Dakota in the NCHC quarterfinals. Now, mind you, this was after they won game one. They had home ice, and then North Dakota stormed back. So when you talk about a team and for lack of a better phrase, this was a disappointing finish, considering that North Dakota also was, shall I say, not the most consistent team last year, and they really felt like they had an opportunity to get back to St. Paul and came up short, especially after winning game one.
Yeah, certainly did. Just a weird, maybe that's the place to start, is almost their schedule a little bit from last season. Again, they dropped both non-conference games by a 4-3 score against Niagara early on in the season. They tied Lake Superior, which if you know how Lake Superior's season went last year, that's a tough one. They lost in overtime to Alaska, which at the time we were kind of wary of, but then as we went through the season, there's one that looked a little bit better on the other side. They ended up splitting with them. A loss and a shootout victory against North Dakota, who ended up giving them fits to the regular season, and seemed to be a concerning trend that carried through into the playoffs. And then losses against Duluth and Denver. Denver, not surprising. Duluth was an overtime finish, so, I mean, whatever. Swept against CC, by the way, outscored 7-4 on the weekend, and then an overtime loss against St. Lawrence. And let's not forget, St. Lawrence also lost to CC, swept CC. So the NCHC not having a great showing in that particular portion in December. They got back on track. They just a single loss to Western Michigan, kind of a blip. Shootout loss to CC in February. Single loss against St. Cloud. Actually handled the Huskies pretty good. A pair of 6-2 scores each way, the only time they saw St. Cloud last season. And then we started to see the cracks kind of form for this team in the middle of the pack here. A pair of losses against North Dakota to finish out the regular season. They win 2-1 that Friday night, like you mentioned, lose 3-1 the next night, and we thought we're in for a really great finish. Not to be 5-2 loss to end their season against North Dakota, who came out of nowhere in sixth place and found a way to use that veteran experience and some of that high-end talent to at least give themselves a chance against St. Cloud the following weekend, and probably, like we said, their best game of the season. Nick, I mean, what do we pull from this schedule here? Because I mean, I think when I look at this is a team that when I see this, I think if I closed my eyes, didn't know who it was, and didn't see necessarily opponents, maybe, for example, I would say this team finished fifth in the conference. Just seeing what I see with that kind of fluctuation. And maybe that's just what the NCHC was, besides Denver's success last season, where we had these ebbs and flows. I mean, what do we take away from Omaha's kind of up and down road that, again, similar to the year they made the NCAAs previously, we had high hopes heading into the postseason, and they really haven't been able to show up when the spotlight's been the brightest?
It's interesting if we're going to use maybe some math or maybe some shapes. I mean, they were a parabola, right? They had a slow start. Yes, for those, it's like, oh yeah, I remember that word. But
I say I was with you with math, even though I suck at it. And then you said shapes, and I got really scared. So
oh geez, those are what does Neil deGrasse Tyson say? Those are oblique spheroids that are out there in the world, and when you look out your window at night. Anyway,
let's just put it this way: when I was a kid, the whole square peg in a round hole thing was definitely a factor in my particular establishment. So I mean,
yes, well, that's why you went to hockey. Does you have a cylindrical thing going into a square?
All I know is I live in America's wasteland, and as much as I complain about some of the IQ levels out here, sorry, North Dakota Fighting Hawks fans, I suppose at times it's applicable that I'm where I'm supposed to be. I'm not sure.
Who knows? But they start slow, they get better as the season goes along, and then again as we get towards the end, when they're facing some of these teams that maybe are playing more desperate, right? Because I think for North Dakota, for sure, they had higher hopes of a better turnout last year. They really had to fight for their playoff lives again. They were not in a pairwise position, so they needed to go on a run to give themselves a chance at an NCAA tournament bid. And I unfortunately for Omaha, even when you go back to the last two of the regular season, they had troubles against North Dakota. And this was a team that, Omaha has had success with them in the past couple of years. In fact, they're one of the more consistent teams that have given North Dakota fits over the last few seasons. And for whatever reason, they just weren't able to really close the book on it. I mean, again, call it desperation, call it what it is. I do think North Dakota woke up after game one and said, wait, we're against the wall here, and if we don't come away with some of our best hockey, we're not even going to make it to St. Paul, which I'm sure NCHC execs also had some arterial fibrillation with that notion. But on all seriousness, that's kind of what we saw. Is we saw a bit of a disappointing finish for Omaha. I remember watching the scores come through on the quarterfinals after game one and saw Nebraska-Omaha winning game one. I thought, okay, this is maybe the year they can finally sort of put the nail in the coffin. And then as we get through the weekend and into Sunday, it's North Dakota that does claw their way back and onto St. Paul. So it does have these rings of where, Omaha has not been, shall we say, a team that has been playoff tested, and it maybe showed a little bit there, right? Am I onto something, Noah? Am I crazy? But I just kind of feel like with Gabinet's squad that certainly there's talent. It's not the most high-end talent. I don't think anybody would argue that, but they play a very team style of play. They play blue collar, but when it gets to these sort of high intense sort of games, or maybe these times where you need your best to step up, they just don't seem to be able to rise to the occasion. And it's disappointing because, again, we've talked about Western Michigan, they've had some pretty good talent come through that program, but maybe the issue is, and I hate to say it, and maybe I'm being too blunt with this, maybe it just isn't enough. And with North Dakota, maybe some of the pedigree that they have, even though it's an off year, they show that they can turn it on when they needed to.
Yeah, are you on to something? Are you crazy? Yes. I think that.
Oh, yes, for both. Okay, good.
Yeah, exactly. I'm trying to figure out what arterial fibrillation is, though. That just sounds like not a good time. I'll go with atrial fib for 500, though, please. However,
I knew you were going to ditch me on that. Oh, God.
Yeah, however, putting fans into cardiac arrest here, if you're not a North Dakota fan, although they do it naturally. Again, 8-8 in 1 goal contest here, and some really interesting underlying numbers here. If we want to talk about maths and shapes and triangles and what have you, 16-3-2 when they scored first, 3-12-1 when they gave up the first goal. I mean, a huge.
That's pear shaped. I get it. So
no, that's me after I have a little bit too much Taco Bell in a given week. But I mean, again,
oh God,
again, with Omaha, there's just a huge discrepancy one way or the other. Power play 21%, PK exactly 79%. Again, a good kind of like balance of in and out for them that just didn't allow them to get past that point when they were trailing 2-6-1 after the first, 3-10-1 after the second. But again, I think the thing that really stands out most to me, their goal differential ended up being whatever it was, +13, +14, something like that. 2.95 goals per game compared to 2.62 given up. And it gets even closer when you're talking about conference numbers. This was not a team that was out of hockey games, but this was also not a team that pulled away in hockey games. They were very much on the razor's edge of games. They found a way to string some really good victories together. A couple of games where they ended up having some big spreads. A couple of games where they lost by some big spreads, but everything else was kind of narrowed down in that margin. And I think for Omaha, that kind of caught up with them in the sense that, and ironically enough, for a team that was playing as many close games as they were, you maybe expected them to handle that challenge a bit more, but I think they just missed a little bit of that offense when it was needed most. And it's hard when you're a team like we talked about with Omaha that brings in a lot of these, B plus, maybe A- guys in terms of the skill set. You're not getting necessarily a blue chipper prospect. That's just been Omaha's struggle with their recruiting. and their focus is on the development process, you sometimes don't get that primo goal scorer or that primo centerman or that good forward line or good first pass puck moving defenseman that is able to kind of be a game breaker, that is able to kind of just turn a game on its head quickly. And that's where I think Omaha was just missing that extra jump, is they had some guys that were productive, that had good seasons, but at the same time, it's like, their highest scorer, Jack Randall, who was a senior last season, had 34 points. No one else eclipsed above 30 points. And the players that did were both graduate players before you get to the next returner in Ty Muller, who's going to be a junior this season. So again, like I said, that's always been UNO's game. Blue collar, hardworking. They're going to give you that physicality. It's going to be a team effort. They're going to win and score by committee. But sometimes, as we've talked about with playoff hockey, you need that goaltender, that defenseman, that primo goal scorer to just kind of pop off for a game or two and push you back across that margin that you need to be. In recent years, UNO just hasn't had that guy when it's mattered. And I think that's just been the most disappointing, because they're there. They're like right on the cusp. They're almost where Western Michigan was before, like, the Ethan Franks and stuff really started to kind of come into their own sort of thing. They're getting there. They had a great finish in the NCHC. I anticipate them to be one of the home teams in the playoffs again, but they've got to find a way to take advantage of it a lot better moving forward. But a great season for them in the regular season. I don't want to diminish that. But again, as we've talked about with teams, Western Michigan, same story with them, just leaves a bit of a sour taste in your mouth when you can't perform during clutch time.
Certainly does. And I think, when we talk about, the coaching staff here, again, Mike Gabinet in his 6th year, Dave Noel Bernier, Peter Aubry, Bennett Hambrook, they've got pedigree on their coaching staff, right? Dave Noel Bernier, former Red Wings video coach, again with Peter Aubry, has spent the last 8 seasons. He's new to the Mavericks this year, but spent the last 8 as a goaltending coach for the Chicago Blackhawks. So they've got good influences. They've got good hockey minds around them. And it's almost needed right now, because when you're lacking that natural skill, right, that natural high-end skill, you have to have good coaching, right? You have to have good systems. And for Omaha, you kind of wonder where this season is. And let me ask you this, Noah, maybe I think this is an appropriate question. Is this sort of a hot seat season for Mike Gabinet? And granted, I say that with respect, because I love Mike Gabinet. I've had many conversations with him. He's a wonderful human being. He's a great coach. But I do kind of get the sense going into his 6th season that with that sour taste, that maybe, there's going to be some expectations of a better result, or, you hate to say it, but hockey is a results-driven business. Maybe some changes are on the way. I don't know. Do you get the sense that he's, on the hot seat, or am I maybe a little bit too far off?
Well, I don't disagree. I think it's more of the you know what? It's honestly similar to the conversation we did have with the Minnesota Wild in their first round exits, where it's like we pushed so hard to get them back into the playoffs, and then it was like, okay, well, now what? Like are we just going to kind of cycle the same thing? Like you said, 19-15-3 for these Mavs, 13-9-2 conference play. It's like a 560 winning percentage across both of those. Like not that much over 500. And I think that kind of keys me in, is like their style of play. It's effective. It's efficient enough in the NCHC to keep them in most hockey games, to give them a chance. But like, what's the next step? What's the next tier for Omaha? And I almost feel like maybe it's because it's the 3rd year that we've been doing these, and we try to stay positive. We're excited about the freshman classes. We try to build some of these teams up, but maybe we're becoming old and bitter and jaded. But now we're starting to see, the trends here and the pieces about this, where it's like for Omaha, it's like, okay, now what? Now what? You've been kind of the Minnesota Wild a little bit, the way the Wild are in the NHL, where they kind of become an afterthought because they're right in the middle of the pack. They're in the mix. They're giving you enough good games to stay relevant, but they're just not quite there. Is it a hot seat type of season for him? I don't think so, but someone I think has definitely turned the kettle on, and the water is at least simmering. I think that's kind of how I would characterize this. I would say within the next 2, maybe 3 years at most, I mean, you got to make it to a frozen faceoff at minimum, I would say. And I would say you would like to have a frozen faceoff victory. You'd like to make a championship game. I think that would kind of put you in the realm of, okay, you need to be there. You probably would really benefit from making an NCAA tournament at that point too, as well. So, I don't know. I don't know that it's particularly warm. I think, again, with Omaha, they know what they have in Mike Gabinet. They know that he is a great fit for that program. Like you said, with Dave in the assistant coach's position as well, too. I think they're a great tandem that has worked really well together. I think the new coaching additions in recent years also going to benefit as well, too. But I think there needs to be just a little bit of kind of a revitalization, a kind of refresh on the fly for them a little bit to just find that extra gear. They're like a 6-speed stuck in 5th gear kind of thing. They're just waiting for that final piece to be unlocked. So I definitely agree that there's going to be some watchful eyes on Omaha. I don't think this season is the year necessarily to get all high and mighty about it. But, if they struggle and they finish 6th or 7th in the conference all of a sudden with the mix that they have coming in, conversation starts to change really quickly.
It does. And under Mike Gabinet, again, going into his 7th season, he actually has never made it to the NCHC Frozen Faceoff. Only one NCAA postseason appearance. That was a 7-2 loss against Minnesota. That was back in 2021. Remember, that was the year that they kind of broke out a little bit. But again, they had some more goal scoring talent on that roster. And even then, going up against a very resurgent Minnesota Gopher squad in that year, that was a tough draw. But again, really haven't been able to enjoy a lot of sustained success, especially in the postseason, right? And I do think you're correct that I do think in the next couple of years, they do have to make it back, or I should say, make it to St. Paul to try to, do what CC did, right? And that is to try to reestablish himself and, see if they can't get a break that way. Well, how are they going to do that here, Noah? As we talk maybe some personnel, I think it's important we discuss some of the departures, right? Because you mentioned some of the high-end talent. They are losing some of that top-end talent. And this, again, when we talk about seasons like Omaha had, or maybe, there's a sour taste in the fans' mouth, certainly that can be replicated in some of the players' minds too, where maybe they felt like, okay, I had a good season. Maybe there isn't just enough around me. No, let's talk about some of the departures for Nebraska-Omaha, and one name in particular is going to be tough to swallow.
Yeah, certainly is. And obviously, on top of that, losing their goaltending strength in recent years, they've had obviously some national team participants that one of which, of course, is staying. But you've got 2 goaltenders departing, 2 defensemen and 3 forwards here. Cam Berg, of course, the sophomore headed to North Dakota, the New York Islanders pick. That's a tough one. I mean, great future for him. There's no doubt about that one. Caden Bolson headed to Mankato, the junior forward. And on Jake Pavanka as well, too, at the graduated forward. He won't be back, of course. Jacob Zab on the goaltending side of things, a graduate, as well as Johnny Tychonik as well, graduating, and Jake Kaczarski in the net mining position as well, too. Davis Pennington headed to Quinnipiac, by the way, on the back end. So some young players with a lot of upside. We talked about the development process for UNO. And again, St. Cloud, Western Michigan, I think 3 programs that I really think of, maybe even throw CC if they have a couple more years of success now into that mix as teams that are very intentional about getting these guys 2, 3, 4 years, trying to really extend that process out and develop them. It's tough to see guys like Cam Berg, Davis Pennington on their way out, guys that, have a lot of upside and they're going to move into their junior seasons and not be with the Mavs anymore. And unfortunately for Omaha, and to their credit, at the same time, they've lost a lot and been really deft at picking up players into the transfer portal as well, too, and bringing in incoming freshmen. They really like to kind of supplement if they can. That's part of their MO as well, too. But like you said, Cam Berg, Davis Pennington, 2 juniors that you're going to miss. Caden Bolson will be a senior this season for the Mavericks, technically, just in Mankato, and then a bunch of graduate players, including a couple of goaltenders that they're going to miss. So I think that Omaha has done a really good job in the past of supplementing with freshmen and transfer portal. The question is, can they get that mix to work again? Because the more transfer and turnover that you have, just ask North Dakota fans, the more certain podcasts start to be wary of how you're going to perform.
So how do you replace that right now? We talked about high-end talent. We talked about how Nebraska-Omaha, doesn't maybe necessarily have a plethora of that. But in terms of some of the guys they're bringing in, including a freshman class, which, mind you, 3 freshmen total on this roster. So they've really had to supplement some of that talent loss with the transfer portal. But I'll tell you what, some of those freshmen that they have coming in are pretty darn good looking players, right? And I think, you talk about trying to build and sustain, right? Again, the loss of Cam Berg, I think, is huge for this squad. So you really had to hit some home runs in the transfer portal as well as in the recruiting side. They've got a couple of really good ones. And what we'll do is I'm going to set you up for this one. Tanner Lidke, who was a 3rd round pick of the Arizona Coyotes, as a forward coming in, man, you talk about some of that replacement skill. As a true freshman, you don't want to ever say you're putting a team on his back, but with these 3 freshmen coming in, they're going to have to sort of pick it up quick.
Yeah, certainly will. And I think, again, as we've talked about here, Omaha is very selective when they bring their freshmen in. I mean, they are a team that doesn't like to over dip. And they're comfortable going in the transfer portal too. But like you mentioned, the Elko, Minnesota native, 2004, again, great season for Lincoln last season. Like you mentioned, 66 points, 57 contests for him, 32 goals, 34 assists. Primo cream of the crop in terms of what Tanner's going to bring to the table. U19 Team USA participant as well, had 6 contests for him too. So, I mean, how can you not feel good? Even as you look, a 0.83 point per game clip over the course of his time in the USHL. Let's not forget the year before, he only had 1 point in 24 contests. So it gives you an idea. He was well over a point per game player, obviously, if you're good at math and shapes and other things like that. Last season for Lincoln, Nick, and shocker, he's a Minnesota native. I mean, are we really that surprised about that whole piece? And I think the thing that is also interesting is you're bringing in players that are young on the forward side. Of course, USHL players that, again, like I said, from Cedar Rapids as well. I'm trying to pull up Charlie's stats here, and it totally crashed on me as well too, Nick. So maybe we'll flip onto the goaltenders and then go backwards here. So Will Craig, by the way, in net, again, we talked about having to supplement that goaltending position. 6'2", 229, Nick. Big body, the 2002 Ontario native. Of course, played for the Peterborough Petes U15, U16. So a little bit of touch playing with players who are potentially like CHL, WHL, OHL bound players as well too. Played in the NAL last season for New Mexico, had a 906 and a 268 goals against average. A couple of good numbers before in the CCHL, 46 contests, a 928, ended up going 30-12-0 and a 928 in the playoffs as well too. So basically a 239 to a 250 as far as his goals against, Nick. And that's been kind of one of Omaha's strengths, by the way, Nick. Does it not feel like is that their goaltending supplementation has been somewhat better than average, to say the least, in recent years?
Well, we remember guys like Isaiah Seville, right, who goes on and plays for the Vegas organization now with, I believe, Henderson in that system. And again, you talk about a team that, when you lack some of that tie-in forward talent, you really have to be sound defensively, and they really did. Similar to Miami, right, where they really had to rely on goaltending and defense to kind of keep them in hockey games. And it has been goaltending. Let's just put it the way it is. That has really been sort of their biggest strength in recent years. And, this is sort of a question mark this year, right, as to who, at least on paper, can they sustain that, right? Now, the other curiosity I have, Noah, is that, when you look up and down this roster, they've got some NHL talent here. Granted, some of it is, transfers in. We talked about the freshman too, the Arizona pick as well. But, I think ideally, if you're Mike Gavin, you're trying to take some of that pressure off of your back end. Now, granted, we've talked about the style of Mike Gavin being that blue collar. I mean, they know how to forecheck, and you're going to feel it, the next week. They certainly like to use the body in a similar sense that Western Michigan has in years past. But, can they mold that style together with some scoring punch, right? Because sometimes, when you're trying to play a certain style and you bring in guys that's not necessarily the game plan, it doesn't mesh very well. So is it a tough ask, Noah, or, as a former player yourself, how does Mike Gabinet, sort of mold a combination or that hybrid of skill as well as some brawn.
Yeah, certainly would agree. I mean, you talked about like Tanner Lidke right? By the way, and of course, he's going to be the primo scorer in this freshman class. The other one, Charlie Lurie, by the way, like you said, coming from Cedar Rapids, has played for Omaha, Youngstown, and then Fargo. A couple of those teams, some really tough seasons. So taking his numbers with a grain of salt, by the way, 68 points in 122 contests, dash 33 over that time. So it gives you an idea of some of the teams that have kind of struggled, and he's still been able to supplement offense. More of a middle of the pack kind of guy I see him. But again, you look at the two freshman players coming in, as far as the forward side here, right? You don't want them probably paired together. You want to put them with some veteran experience. I think if you can get them up to speed, especially Tanner Lidke, making them feel comfortable in the role that they're in, that's step one. If you can get both of those guys feeling like they're top 9 guys, that they're productive, they're comfortable in their roles, I think that alleviates a lot of pressure. You're obviously going to have some transfers that we're going to talk about in a second. But when you're trying to supplement that offense, like you said, it really kind of goes more about towards the mental and confidence piece and really approaching the game the right way. I feel like, and I don't know, I mean, obviously I didn't play Division I college hockey, but I mean, my kind of role when I was a forward is I try to be a 200-foot guy, but really trying to score goals. I mean, and that's what keeps you in the lineup, is being productive. And a lot of times when you end up scoring goals as a shooter, first you have to get a taste for it. I know that sounds obvious, but you kind of have to earn that nose for the net and kind of smell blood in the water a little bit. And sometimes the way guys figure that out is different. Unless you're a real high-end guy, sometimes guys who suddenly get that success at a school like Omaha, for example, they realize that not every puck has to be a toe drag around a defenseman perfectly placed top corner. It just has to be on a side of the net, has to get through a screen, has to just be a quick release, has to surprise a goaltender, has to just be on net. And I think getting these guys comfortable with, we're going to be a hard-nosed physical team. You're going to bring that brawn. You're going to bring that physicality. But then once we get the puck, we're not going to mess around with it. We want to keep possession, but we want to be driving plays towards the net. Pucks on net, rebounds, opportunities, tips, screen in front. That's where that brawn and that skill start to meet, because what you're really developing is a nose for the net. You're really developing that goal scorer's touch, that ability to be around the crease. And I think if you can get these freshmen up to speed, the transfers come in and obviously give them a chance as well too. We'll touch on the transfers in just a second here, Nick. I think that that's where they need to start. It's almost more of a mental confidence to say, yeah, I'm going to put this puck on net because I know that this is going to be successful. I know this is the right play, versus if you're hesitant, if you think a split second too late, that puck's off your stick and the opportunity goes by the wayside.
And that's where, as you mentioned, some of these transfers are going to come in and trying to be sort of that, not just veteran presence, but just trying to be like, okay, we need to fill some hole with experience, right? And the guys you got coming in, they have it, right? And Noah Ellis, again, the sophomore coming over from UMass, just one season there with the Minutemen. He's a Vegas pick, so shut down kind of a defenseman.
Very much so.
Then they got Jesse Lansell, the graduate coming over from Notre Dame. Same thing with the defenseman Dom, is it Vidoli, coming over from Ohio State, and then Zach Erdahl coming over from Wisconsin. So some prolific programs, one that would assimilate, I think, pretty well in terms of the style and the
two of them easily. Jesse Lansell and Zach Erdahl both. And say what you want about Wisconsin, but being a sophomore playing in 34 contests for Zach Erdahl and having 11 points on that Wisconsin Badgers team, which was horrible last season, that's a great achievement. Jesse Lansell, Notre Dame was middle of the pack in the Big Ten, which middle of the pack in the Big Ten is not a bad way to spend a day, to be honest with you.
Especially last year, right? I mean, that pack was, pack's pretty.
Yeah, I mean, besides Wisconsin, everybody else was in the mix, and even the Badgers got better as the season went on. 15 points for Jesse Lansell last year. Like you mentioned, both the defensemen, a little bit more shut down defensemen, but I mean, Dominic Vidoli, like you mentioned, coming over from Ohio State, that's just pedigree in the Big Ten as well too. Noah Ellis, like you mentioned, Vegas draft pick, and the Minutemen had a really down year last year, but I mean, curious to see how he assimilates. And then Seth Eisel, by the way, he'll be a graduate netminder, a 2.86 and a 9.13 on a Lake Superior squad, by the way, that was not good at all. So I would say part of that might be bolstered with shot volume as well too, but the puck still got to hit you at some point. So I'm really curious to see And I always butcher his name. So Mavs fans, I 110% apologize in advance. I always want to say Likotsky, but it's not. Simon Likotsky, the freshman netminder, 919 save percentage for him. It's a 232 goals against average. And obviously he's a Slovakia native, played on the national team as well too. He's a guy that probably will have a chance at the net, but I also think that bringing in Seth from Lake Superior as a backup option, I don't think is going to be too bad. I think that he's a very serviceable 1B. He could see some playing time this season, depending on how Simon plays. So the goaltending position, a little bit in flux for Omaha. I still like the mix. Again, that's why we have them at number 3, is I like enough of the mix. And we know what Mike Gabinet gets out of a lot of these guys is you're going to get a good work ethic, 110%, night in and night out. You mentioned it perfectly, Nick. Can we find that scoring touch? Can we turn that physicality, that hard F1 in on the forecheck, that cycle play that they're so good at? Can they turn that into plays in the middle, offensive opportunities, second chance opportunities? Because those are the type of plays, Dave Shayak, greasepan goals if you're a Huskies fan, that end up pushing you to a national championship game if you're a St. Cloud fan. I mean, that's the type of goals that you have to be able to score in playoff time. You got to get a little bit of goaltending help. Everybody's got to show up and play. But man, if you just have a line or a duo or, a defensive pairing that you can rely on, that you can say when they're on the ice, I don't know that they're going to pot one, but boy, the offensive chances are going to be flowing. Omaha needs that. That's their 6th gear. That's their next opportunity to turn this Z28 into a Porsche 911, right? Like that's their opportunity here. And I'm really excited about this mix. Again, I like it similar to when we talked about Western Michigan, very on brand for what Omaha likes to do in the transfer portal and in the freshman class. Now can Mike Gabinet find that extra piece with the group that he's brought in? And again, like we talked about, they've lost a couple of guys, that Davis Pennington, Cam Berg, that are going to be a difficult time to replace, and it might take a few games or a couple of months.
And it might will. One thing that they'll have to do, Noah, is I think, when we talk about schedule here, is their non-conference has to be a lot better. I think really hurt them, especially in the pairwise. They were in a similar position as North Dakota was when they played them in the quarterfinals, which is their path essentially to the postseason was an NCHC Frozen Face-Off Championship. And I know that with St. Cloud and some other teams that, we talk about, the non-conference record has been essentially almost like a buoy, right, for some of the struggles that some of these teams have had, especially later in the season. So let's talk about that schedule, right? So Omaha will open up with an exhibition game at Minnesota State. And remember last year, Noah, when Omaha had a non-conference game early? Remember that?
Yeah,
about that.
They were very lucky. They were very lucky that also it was a non-conference game. Let's just
right for those playing the home game. They destroyed Minnesota State 7.
Yeah, it's tough.
Was not good. But here's where it went off the rails. Right, last year they lose 2 games at Baxter and against Niagara, and I think, is this a redemption tour, Noah? Because when we look at their schedule again, it's Niagara again at Baxter Arena. No question, they need a different result there, because then they welcome Ohio State. They've got 6, 7, 8 straight at home to start off the year, minus the exhibition, which will be in Mankato this year. So again, Niagara, Ohio State, Western Michigan, and then in between an NCHC break, they have Long Island coming into play at Baxter Arena. So an early start here will be key for Omaha to try to get themselves in a much better position, not only for the pairwise, but just feeling good about where they're at, right?
Yeah, I can't tell you how angry it makes me that Mankato game is an exhibition contest. I'm just going to put that out there right now, because I mean, that's just one of those games that it just feels like it should just be on the table, and this is not speaking from last year and the finish there. It feels like a matchup, CCHA, NCHC, fantastic litmus test early in the season. I mean, it's great hockey, but man, exhibition game, take that away. No, I don't care what the NCAA rules are. Just slip it in there and boom. Okay. So, but nonetheless, speaking of shapes and things that never mind, euphemisms notwithstanding. But October 7th is that game against Mankato. The following weekend, Niagara, like you mentioned, and then Ohio State. That will be a great litmus test, by the way. Of course, you have a former Ohio State player coming into the mix as well too for this Mavs squad. So curious to see him play against his old program. That's the tail end of October. Then Western Michigan and LIU, a 6-game, in fact, 8-game homestand, Nick, by the way. Then they play Denver, holiday weekend, a home and home against Augustana, which is a cool phrase to say, if I do say so myself. Nebraska, night number 1, Sioux Falls on the 25th on that Saturday, on the road against Duluth. And then they do see St. Cloud at home to cap off the first half of the regular season. So the Huskies get them right before the holiday break. I kind of stole your thunder here going through the list here, Nick, but
kind of did, but that's normal. So
yeah, well, and that's why I'm here. That's why I get paid the $0, right?
You and me both.
But honestly, this will be awesome, I think.
I know. But how important is it for that first half, right? Because I know we talked about non-conference in that first half, and then the second half actually starts off kind of neat. We'll touch on that here in a second, but it isn't a cakewalk per se, but there's opportunity here for, if you play well, you could at least be feeling good about where you're at. And more importantly, as you turn the calendar into 2024, you maybe could have some momentum on your side as you head into the second half, which it's going to be a tough second half. I'll put it that way.
Yeah, like we said, Ohio State and Western Michigan too in that first half, back to back. So that's going to be a tough one. You'd like to be at least 500 in that grouping. Got to take care of Niagara, I would think. I mean, you just can't have what happened last year, or at least you got to split at minimum, I would say. Yeah. LIU, you got to take care of. Denver's going to be a good team again this season. Augustana is a wild card. I mean, you'd like to be at least 500 there. I mean, you don't really know, and that's in the middle of November, so they're going to have some games under their belt at that time. Duluth have a chance to sweep, I think, if you're a Mavericks fan and everything goes to plan. And the Huskies, well, no chance, right? I mean, come on, the Huskies take both of those. No, that'll be a great matchup. You know what? Actually, St. Cloud historically, I would say in recent years, has really struggled against Omaha, to be honest with you, especially in Baxter. They have not found a way to solve the Mavs there. And at home, even at the Herbrooks National Hockey Center, it's been some tightly contested games too. So first half, Nick, a lot of opportunity, bit of a staggered schedule between NCHC and non-conference play. Good chance for these freshmen, these transfers to assimilate.
Yeah, no, so let's look at that second half of the season, because let's just say it starts off kind of fun. First ever Desert Classic, right? They're going to be traveling down to a future NCHC opponent in Tempe, Arizona, into Arizona State, although the exact opponents aren't listed, but that's kind of fun, right? You get to get out of, shall we say, the Midwest and head down to Arizona, where it'll be a bit warmer this time of year, again, the first weekend of January. But then the fun begins, because then you've got to travel all the way back the other side of the country, and your first big test out of the holiday break is at North Dakota, right? So, and it doesn't get any easier. And in fact, Noah, this second half of the schedule, I'll let you kind of walk through this, but this is a tough second half.
Colorado College, tail end of February, the Tigers, believe it's the only time, that they see the Tigers this season. And then the only time they see Miami right after that, actually a couple of tail end single game sets for these teams. And then finishing at home against North Dakota, which they did last season, playing North Dakota, and things got a little bit dicey. So North Dakota actually at Ralph Engelstad might be a bit of a better matchup for these Mavs coming out of the holiday break, because they've done well. They've done well historically, but this second half, not a favorable schedule. North Dakota, Denver, St. Cloud, Duluth, Western, CC, Miami, and who knows what we're going to get out of that Miami squad this year, and then North Dakota to finish things out. And if they finish anywhere close, they're going to get any of these teams in this mix when it comes to the NCHC quarterfinals. So
and I think, Noah, when we look at this Omaha squad, again, as we said it at the top, I really do feel like that non-conference record's going to be huge for them. Again, first half to second half, it's night and day in terms of the difficulty of the schedule. I think really for Omaha, we're probably going to know before the holiday break where this team is going to be, and then give it a couple of weeks after they get back from Arizona to see if they can carry that hopefully some momentum for them into the second half of the year, because again, it's tough. But Noah, again, we have these guys at third. Question is, where do we feel like they will sit? I mean, yeah, and what I mean by that is, yes, we have them at 3. Now, last time I checked, we don't pretend, nor do we have a crystal ball for these sorts of things. But I do kind of wonder, are they like in a similar position to North Dakota, which is, are they sort of a wild card when it comes to, where they might finish in terms of, and we hate to be that group of people that says it, but you kind of wonder, and maybe some hockey fans are looking at this in the NCHC, did we have them too high in our preseason poll? It's hard to say, but tell me, what do you think?
Well, I think we undersold and over-delivered last year, and maybe we over-delivered and maybe should have undersold this year. Not sure. I think, again, if I had to group it, I would say 7, 6, 5 are probably in the same mix from what we've had. And I say Omaha and Western Michigan are probably in their own mix right now. So, again, I feel like, they're third, fourth, maybe even fifth. I mean, 3 to 5 is maybe a relative landing point for them, just depending on how they handle things in conference, at least. Now, non-conference, obviously, if they want to make an NCAA push, they've got to do much better, like you said, as opposed to what they did last season. But yeah, I mean, again, we've kind of talked about the Mavs, and when they're hot, they're hot. When you're not, right? I mean, there's the old song about that, obviously, that came out well before my time. But I mean,
or my time too, which is not very often. So,
yeah, what did they have? Stone record players back then? I mean, that's something else.
I know.
you must, yeah. Even the photos of the events were in color back then.
That's when you can paint them. Yeah, it's nice.
Yeah, we figured out colors, and then the Polaroid came along, and everything changed.
That was a game changer, buddy.
Yeah, well,
let me tell you.
Well, looking at the VHS tapes and listening to this podcast on the Walkman here, I can tell you that this Mavs team does have a chance to. I don't know that I would put them higher than 3 in the conference. We have them at 3 because I still think that their mix is good enough and their style of play is good enough to really be a weekend in, week out formidable force because of the physicality and the gauntlet of the NCHC. Their style of play fits well for the grueling schedule for the NCHC. Now, when we come to tournament time, playoff time, things definitely change for this group here. I don't think they get higher than 3, which it's rare that we pick a team at 3 and say that they're not going to go up. I just don't see them going past that. Maybe it's because we have a certain team in the top 2 that we have an affiliation with too, who's to say, but I think this Mavs team still has a good opportunity with this mix to bring that physicality. They just need some offensive supplementation. That's just what they need. And they got to get at least average to above average goaltending if they want a chance. Their defensive structure, what their defensemen bring, has been pretty consistent, very blue collar, very 200-foot style of play. If they could get an offensive defenseman out of that mix, that would be really nice too. But their forwards and their high-end guys, someone, a duo, a trio on the forward side has to break through this season. They have to kind of carry the mail. They have to be a threatening force, if anything, to create a little bit of secondary scoring under the radar down the line. I think if Omaha can do that, they're going to be just fine.
If you're listening to this podcast on your Walkman, I remember mine, it had shock protection. What isn't shocking, I know I'm terrible today. But honestly, it isn't really that surprising that we have them this high, right? I do think there may be, again, I still think that first half is going to be very telling for us. And, is there a potential for them to slide? I think there might be. I just don't expect them to, right? And again, they're a team that, with their balance and whatnot, they're a team that's just going to have to win by committee. And they've done that since, essentially for a while, right? Even while under Mike Gavin, and even before then, they've had to essentially utilize essentially everybody to try to contribute and then make a push towards, that ultimate goal, as Shea, is winning a national championship. Noah, of course, as you mentioned, an affiliation, right? This is the Huskies Warming House podcast, and we always ask the question with every preview: how does the St. Cloud State Huskies match up against Omaha, and more importantly, how did they come away with W's in their matchups coming up this year? There's 4 times that these two teams will be facing off against each other.
Yeah, absolutely. And affiliations, by the way, centerisu.com, Huskies Illustrated will have those 4 matchups and everything covering that. You're home for all things St. Cloud hockey, including the latest news and photos of your Huskies as they battle the Mavericks. And of course, the Soda Pod, our partner, staying wild and up to date with us in the state of hockey, especially when they come visit the Herb Brooks National Hockey Center. Huskies Warming House podcast. Very thankful for that. And this Omaha matchup is always a good one. It's been a tough test for St. Cloud because, again, that blue collar workman style, this maybe coupled with Western Michigan, one of the few teams that might out physical St. Cloud somewhat heavily, and you have to be able to match that pound for pound. If they're able to limit the neutral zone, meaning the Omaha Mavericks, and able to stymie the speed and skill and offensive rush and transitional play that St. Cloud brings to the table, the Mavs are going to give St. Cloud a tough test. I could easily see this series being 500 in either direction. I could see an overtime finish or two. That's highly possible between these two clubs. Goaltending going to be a big factor. I might give that edge right now to St. Cloud just with the veteran experience. And I think as far as the defensive core and the raw talent on the forward side for the high-end talent, that probably goes to St. Cloud. As far as the complete spread of players, the workman-type mentality, the effort level, and the ability to grind below the dots, below the top of the circles, the edge definitely goes to Omaha. So if you're a defenseman for St. Cloud, pucks are getting chipped in deep, you got to be able to pivot, get on your high horse. First pass has to be there. If it's not there, hit an outlet, puck off the glass. You have to alleviate pressure in the defensive zone. When Omaha starts to buzz, when they start to get a cycle going, start to get that forecheck going, suddenly they get a line change or two in there in the offensive cycle. Bad things happen for the defensive teams here. Now, you got to keep Omaha out of the middle. That's the name of the game. If you've watched a hockey game before, at some point, the puck's got to come through the middle of the ice. I think St. Cloud would be okay, even with that pressure, if they can keep things out of the house. But if things start to break down and Omaha finds a bit of that grit, which is what we're waiting to see, if they can bring that extra element again this year, get some scoring touch in the middle of the ice, this is going to be a dog fight, cattle fight. Is there a dog cattle reference, something on the ranch reference that I can pull out of this? I'm struggling mightily. I tell you what, you know what the Mavs also need, by the way? They need to bring back, what is it, the old bullhead logo, by the way, that they had on the those beautiful. I mean, I know some of their jerseys are clean in the UNO, and I even like the little O logo that they have. Their website is great, by the way, too. That they do a fantastic job with that. Another team that really does a great job with their website production, by the way, too. But yeah, they have so many options for some great retro jerseys, some really cool stuff. I know they've dipped into it in years past. Just a heads up, Mavs fans, gray is not the play. Black or white, as far as black for sure. I mean, maybe even a bit of red. Maybe throw something interesting in there as well too. Some reverse retro fun. I have no idea.
Alternate, as a black, as like an offset. That would actually look really nice.
Yeah, one of the only other teams in the WCHA. Wow, in the NCHC that pulls out that red color palette. Yeah, absolutely. When we're talking old WCHA, Omaha was not in that mix. So or St. Cloud might be wearing their reds for a change as well too, because I love St. Cloud's reds as well. But that's my only recommendation. If the Huskies are wearing whatever color that these two teams seem to really share, in your opinion, Nick, same question. How do these Huskies limit the offense and create some of their own?
I really do think it starts with, shutting down their forecheck. And as you mentioned, it's got to get on your horse. But, this team, when they've been successful and disrupted that first defenseman touch, right? A lot of it is because the defensemen are going and they're not peeking over their shoulder. They're not looking at what their options are, because Omaha's coming at you fast. And they've got essentially one goal of mine. They're going to either hit you or they're going to hit you after you get rid of the puck, right? They come down and they really want to squeeze you behind your own net and essentially try to force a bad play, force a bad decision. And St. Cloud in years past has not thought, shall we say, that step or two ahead, like you see some other some other teams that have done that. So this is where guys like Dylan Anhorn, this is where guys like Jack Peart, right, could really help the Huskies essentially turn a strength for Omaha into almost like turn it on its head a little bit, right? And also for the forwards, right, being aware that Omaha's going to come at you a little bit, and to know that you're going to have to be in those spots where you have to give your defenseman an opening, be in a lane, and be ready for it, because sometimes they're not going to be able to cradle the puck. Sometimes it's going to be a hard rim. Sometimes it's going to be off the glass. So you do have to be able to read the play, coming it back on your own end and being in the right spot, so that way you can transition. And that's how you can create some odd man opportunities against Omaha too. And then similarly, that's where the cycle game and the Huskies can come into play. They're not the most, physical team. And I would argue, again, like you mentioned, that bottom six for Huskies, that's going to be, shall we say, the biggest test, because Omaha definitely has the Huskies beat in that retrospect, is that depth. In terms of, just the physicality and just the way they play. But if you can wear them down by just possessing the puck, and again, not necessarily being selective, but I think offense from defensemen, right? Get pucks through. Omaha likes to block shots too, remember. So they will lay down. So guys like Dylan Anhorn, again, that can be mobile. You talk about guys like Vidi Mietin that do have rocket shots, right? And then you talked about Dave Shayak. Again, those forwards coming around the net. If you can't break through while the puck is on your stick, do a flyby when the puck is released. You got to crash that crease, look for those rebounds, and get into the kitchen, as they say. I think that's how you have to do it. But it all starts from the back end, and no question Bart Larson has, that always been a matchup that, he really wants to try to essentially be better at transition game, especially from behind his net, and then more so avoiding getting trapped with the physical play.
So here's the deal, Nick. We are less than 2 weeks away now from women's hockey action on the St. Cloud side. Less than 4 weeks, less than a month away on the men's side from hockey getting rocking and rolling, especially for the Mavs as well, too. By the way, next week we are at number 1 in the WCHA with the Ohio State Buckeyes. And then the week after, we do have Denver. The question is, do we have them at number 2 or do we have them at number 1? Answers to come, of course, and then we will cover both our St. Cloud teams as we get recaps and games underway. Excited for hockey season to get rolling once again. I'm Noah Grant. That was Nick Maxon, and we will see you soon in the den.
And your one-timer coming, they score! Ripped in! A bomb from Mavericks!
Dana Rasmussen fires and she scores! Dana Rasmussen for the Huskies.
Dwayne Kaprizov in for a chance to win it. He scores! Kirill the Thrill is for real! Welcome to the NHL, a game winner.
St. Cloud Cathedral is now 42.6 seconds away from wrapping up the school's first ever title.